What is the craziest real-life plot twist story you have? Story 1. I was best friends with a neighbor kid growing up. He was always over at my house or I was at his, and I had a major crush on him pretty much since I was old enough to walk. But it never seemed like he liked me back or even noticed that I liked him. As we grew up, he started dating people and I was jealous of it. I started dating people while still pining over him. I figured he just saw me as a little kid. I was a year younger than him, or a little sister, and nothing would ever come out of it. So I tried to put my feelings aside. Then his family moved out of state and we lost contact. I got over my feelings and time moved on. Fast forward a few years later, and we reconnected online, started talking, and then this dude casually mentioned in a conversation how he had a giant crush on me growing up and always wanted to ask me out. He told me that he even asked my mother for permission to ask me out and she said no, so he never ended up doing it. My mom never told me about this at all. My mind was blown. My entire childhood of pining after this guy, my first ever crush, felt like a lie. At this point, I'd long since put aside the feelings I had for him and kind of gone over the crush, but I still felt a lot of residual nostalgia from being 15. He was still into me and I was debating whether I wanted to start something with him or not, mostly so I wouldn't have to live with the what-ifs of it all, tossing the idea around while we kept in touch. Then suddenly he stopped messaging me. I'm like, huh? Our chats were going well and I don't think I did anything to make him want to start ghosting me. I messaged a mutual friend of ours and asked if she knew what was up, and she told me the guy was arrested for roughing up a dude who owed him money. He's in prison right now, serving a life sentence. The end. Moms definitely know best. Suddenly, from a villain, her mom just became a hero. Story 2. The husband of an elderly couple near me passed away about a year ago. The wife, for most of her adult life, had a pretty serious drinking habit, and her husband kept her on track. A month or two after his passing, she found someone new on the internet. He quickly moved in, but something wasn't right about him. He'd often be seen buying multiple bottles of vodka and whiskey and taking them home with him. He was doing this every 1 to 2 days. Anyway, soon after, the police came, asking people in the local area to see if anyone had seen the elderly woman and her new partner, as they believed they had recently gone married. This could be because if she were to pass, her nice house would be left to him now. He kept buying alcohol, presumably for her, until 2 police vans, an ambulance, and crime scene investigators were seen outside the house. No one has been seen in or around the house since. At first, I thought he was trying to exploit this poor woman through a drinking habit, but he got fed up and tried to harm her so he could have the house. But according to neighbors, she ended him to stop the apparent cruelty he's been putting her through. She is apparently in a secure unit now where she will most likely stay. Story 3. I used to have a friend named Tiffany in middle school. I wasn't so good with people and I was a little rough around the edges. I was very jealous because she was incredibly dainty and feminine, while I was a begrudging tomboy. In middle school, her very sketchy father withdrew her from classes and we lost contact. She was homeschooled for a while and then she and her mother escaped to a woman's shelter and set up a new life in Kentucky. I learned all this from the grapevine. I found her mother, brothers, aunts, and uncles on Facebook, so why couldn't I find her? For 2 years, I searched every few months for her online, desperate to reconnect and apologize to the friend I had such intense jealousy for and explained that I was unintentionally rude because I envied how feminine she was, while I felt like a brick wall of a girl. Finally, one day her mother replied to my friend request, and I found out the reason that I never could find her name on Facebook. He goes by TJ now. Story 4. A coworker broke up with his bartender ex and started pursuing me. He told me that the ex had been stalking him and wouldn't leave him alone. He made a point to publicly call out the bartender at work for being weird and tell her to leave him alone. We started dating, and things were cool for a few weeks. Then he invited me over for a small party and, oddly enough, the ex was there. I kept my distance from both of them as I had no idea what the hell was happening. A few hours in, the ex-girlfriend changed into pajamas. I realized he got back together with her at some point and never told me. The next day at work, I found out that he told everyone that I tried to entice him and make him cheat on the bartender. They all believed him and treated me like garbage for months after that. His behavior towards me got scarier inside and outside of work. I couldn't tell anyone because I was the lying boyfriend stealer. I never knew about depression before this fiasco. It's crazy when exes don't tell you that they've already broken up with you. While the outcome of this story is crazy, the next story's outcome is hilarious. Story 5. I've grown up hearing about my Cherokee ancestry from my dad's side of the very southern family. One of my cousins has gone on a spirit journey and spent a good amount of time researching our Cherokee heritage to connect with our familial roots. The 2-minute version of the family story tells us how a patriarch of my family met the woman of his dreams and moved out into the forest to live as a true Cherokee father would. He left the rest of our family behind. Several years ago, my grandmother got very into Ancestry.com. As they researched our family tree, they found out that we had no Cherokee blood. However, my great-great-great-grandma was a black woman. It makes me so happy to think about my prejudiced uncles and extended family finding out that we are 0% Cherokee and that my generation is 1/16 black. The further you go up my family line, the more black we are. I love it. Story 6. I used to play an online browser game back in 2003 to 2006-ish. And while the game itself wasn't great, the community was what made it work. I got to know a lot of people from my guild. We had an IRC channel where I was one of the main regulars, another regular from a different country, also in the EU, and I became good online friends. After we stopped playing the game, contact became scarce and eventually petered out completely. We had connected on Facebook but never actually talked. 2 years ago, in a nostalgic moment, I decided to reach out to some of the people from that game and see if we could have some sort of reunion. I sent a message to this guy and our conversation went something like this. Me. Hey man, long time no talk. What's up in your life these days? Him. Oh hey, I live in your country now, lol, with my girlfriend I met online. Me. That's funny. Whereabouts? Him. Town that's 10 minutes away from me. We talked some more and the subject of work came up. He then told me he works in a different city, about 20 minutes further away. The city he named is where I was born and where my mother works. I asked him where exactly, and the place he named was right across the canal from my mother's business. A stone's throw away. Funnily enough, we fell out of contact again right after that due to other things going on in our lives, but we plan on meeting up sometime soon. Story 7. I taunted my little sister her entire life about the fact that she looked nothing like me and our dad. I always made your adopted jokes about her and stuff. It became an inside joke between us. I'd tell her we found her on the doorstep and she'd say, "Thank God. That means I'm not actually related to you." My parents kind of frowned at it because it was mean, but my sister could take a joke, and she knew I was just teasing her. She joked about it herself. I found out a couple of years ago that she was the product of a short-lived affair. My dad accepted her as his own and my parents kept it a secret from everyone. They told her last year. I still make maybe your adopted jokes about her, but they're 100% funnier now. Damn, props to the dad. Man, the plot twists in these stories are definitely unexpected. If you like stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat, check out my other videos. What are you waiting for? Hit the like button and subscribe now. Story 8. My dad was adopted as a baby because his parents were both teens from Catholic families who were sent to boarding schools across the country from each other. Many years later, my dad decided to search for his biological parents to explore potential hereditary health problems. He eventually connected with both his mom and dad separately, but the twist came when his parents, now with grown kids and deceased spouses, also got in touch with each other. About 5 years ago, my brother and I joined our dad for a family reunion at my grandpa's farm, where we discovered his parents were once again in love. They'd invited both of their families to celebrate the occasion, bringing together close to 100 people, including dozens of cousins and several aunts and uncles. It was all thanks to my dad that these two huge families came together, making new connections. Throughout the weekend, my brother, I, and our dad were treated like celebrities, and everyone wanted to get to know us. Though my dad's adoptive mother passed away over a year ago, he now has two new parents who are relatively young and extremely interesting people. We go skiing at my grandpa's condo in Montana and enjoy summer activities at his vast farm property in Alberta. The whole experience taught me that you're never too old for a new love, and I'm grateful to have grandparents for many more years to come. Story 9. My boyfriend of 2 years broke up with me and I was pretty upset. However, I got asked out on a date and said yes, thinking I was ready. I was wrong. I had a miserable time and couldn't hit it off with this guy even though he was trying. Anyway, he took me to a concert on the other side of the city, an area I'm not familiar with and never get to go. On the way home, feeling sad, I texted my ex, which was lame, but I did it. My date thought something was wrong with one of his back tires and pulled over into an apartment complex. It's 1 a.m., dark, and I took little notice. While he was outside fiddling with the tire, I got a text back from my ex, basically telling me he wished he had never met me and to leave him alone. At that point, I was trying not to cry, realizing how big of a mistake it was to go out that night. In general, I was feeling depressed and thinking I'd never be happy again. I told the date guy I was sorry, but I wasn't ready to be in a relationship again so soon. The night ended. 2 months later, I finally felt like I was moving on and tried online dating. I hit it off with the guy I was talking to. We met up, had a great time, and started dating. The first time he brought me back to his place, it was nighttime. Looking around the outside of the apartment complex, I couldn't shake the familiar feeling that I'd been there before, which didn't make sense because this was 45 minutes from where I lived and not an area I ever went to. On the second night, we left using the back gate, and it hit me that this was the same apartment complex the guy had pulled off into earlier on the date. I went, "Oh my god, I almost had an emotional breakdown right there." Long story short, I married the new guy, and we have been together for 10 years now. I know it's just a coincidence, but I find it crazy that of all the apartments in Houston, we stopped at the one my future husband lived at. He was literally feet away from me while I was in a car, having one of the lowest moments of my life and feeling like I would never find someone again. Story 10. My maternal grandfather's father was an immigrant. His mother divorced his father while my grandfather was very young, remarried, and had grandpa adopted by her new husband. He was still always referred to as a stepfather because grandpa hated him. Mom grew up hearing that her biological father was French and her grandmother divorced him after he bought a dress for another woman. And she was so angry with him that she even refused to admit they'd ever been married, so he got deported back to Europe. When Mom was in high school, her grandmother let it slip that her biological grandfather wasn't French at all. He was Italian. The Italians were on the wrong side of World War II, so Grandpa lied to avoid facing more prejudice than he already did for being raised by a single mother and having an immigrant father. When I was a small child, the story was that my great-grandfather was Italian. He'd bought a dress for another woman, and my angry great-grandma divorced him and had him deported. My mom's a genealogy fanatic, so she made some attempts to get records from the Italian government but didn't find anything, even when we went and visited Italy after my best friend moved there when I was in 7th grade. A few years later, we found out why. My biological great-grandfather was never deported. He'd moved to Detroit, gotten remarried to a woman with almost the same name as my great-grandmother, and had a son. Grandpa, who was in his 80s, found out that he had a half-brother he'd never known about. Not only that, but his biological father might never have bought a dress for another woman. There's an alternate story where he used to joke that he and my great-grandmother weren't really married because they'd never had a Catholic ceremony. She was Baptist, he was Catholic. Great-grandma got mad and threatened to divorce him if he did it again, then did. As it turns out, they may have not been legally divorced. My great-grandma allegedly paid her uncle, who was a judge, to divorce them because my great-grandfather didn't want to get divorced. But there's no record of them being divorced, and apparently my great-grandfather had a very hard time getting remarried. My great-grandfather also tried to stay in contact with my grandpa and provided for him, but my great-grandmother wouldn't let him. We've met my great-uncle. He's frighteningly similar to my grandfather in some ways that can only be explained by genetics. They both laugh the same way, do this weird side hug thing where they pull you in really tightly, and like to clasp both your hands when they talk to you about anything involving feelings. He has the same eyes as my mom and likes sports and genealogy like her too. It's pretty cool, and I wish we'd found out about him sooner. Story 11. When I was in college, my father retired and moved to New Orleans. He had lived there in his 20s and 30s, and his 2 sons from his first marriage still lived there. He moved into a cool apartment complex with a swimming pool in the center courtyard and a lot of sociable people his age. One of them was a retired Army general. I'll call him Tom. My dad and Tom were the same age and both Korean War veterans. My dad had been in the Marines for 4 years during the latter part of the war, while Tom had stayed in and risen through the ranks. Tom had been to Ranger School in the Special Forces pipeline and was a country expert for Korea. He was in Korea for most of the Cold War, training ROK Marines, gaming out World War II scenarios, and working closely with a large private corporation. He retired shortly before September 11th. He was a full colonel at the time and was promoted to brigadier general just before retirement to sweeten his pension. After 9/11, the government expanded the Federal Air Marshal Service and asked Tom to come out of retirement to lead the restructuring. They promoted him to major general so that he would have clout among the other generals, GS-15 civilian employees and private sector executives he'd be working with. Colin Powell pinned a second star on him personally in the White House. At this time, I was in the Marine Reserve myself and getting ready to graduate college. I'd not yet been called up for OIF or OEF, so I was looking for the first grown-up job. My dad suggested that being an air marshal could be fun for a year or two, even if it wasn't exactly something I was interested in. My dad arranged a phone call with Tom to talk about my options. At this point, I'd met Tom many times when I'd go to visit my dad. He was one of the kindest men I've known. We'd sit around the pool and I would pick his brain endlessly about his military experience and the spy adventures he was at liberty to talk about. As a young enlisted Marine, it's hard to describe the feeling of being close to a 2-star general. If you're a lance corporal in a rifle platoon and the major shows up in the barracks, you snap to attention and bark out, "Attention on deck!" like it was Darth Vader walking in the room. Somebody with stars in their collar might just give you a heart attack right there. Tom was a widower and an old Southern gentleman. When he dated women here and there, he lit a cigarette for me by the pool one day, and I noted that his Zippo had a Ranger crest on it. He said that his daughter had given it to him years before and he thought it was gaudy at the time, but he came to cherish it after his daughter passed away. She had been an avid equestrian and was in a car accident in Costa Rica in the 70s or early 80s while she was down there for some kind of riding event. His wife succumbed to cancer some years later. At any rate, we spoke on the phone about the Air Marshal program. He couldn't answer a lot of my questions due to operational security, but we talked for about an hour. In the end, another job came up and I didn't opt for the Air Marshal program. After the Iraq invasion, Tom left the Air Marshal program and worked into Condoleezza Rice's staff as a national security aide. All in all, everyone loved Tom. He and my dad became very good friends in a few short years. Tom took my brother's kids to Saints games. Tom would swing by some evenings, and my niece and nephew and all the neighborhood kids would come running, yelling, "Mr. Tom!" as they do in the South. I was mobilized in 2004 and my father passed away shortly before I deployed to Iraq. I went to New Orleans on emergency leave and my brothers, their wives, my sister, my girlfriend, and I drove to Grand Isle, Louisiana to scatter his ashes in the Gulf. Tom wore his full-dress uniform. After the ashes were in the water, Tom removed his white gloves and threw them in as well. I'd not known this tradition before, but I was touched by it. He choked back tears and a lump formed in his voice. Later, he took my sister and me to an expensive dinner at one of the finest restaurants in New Orleans and told us he was always there for us. Anything we needed, anytime. I fell out of touch with Tom after deploying and coming home. When Katrina hit, I called my sister-in-law Maggie to see if everyone was okay. I asked about Tom and she said, "Oh my God, you didn't hear about Mr. Tom?" I tensed up and said, "No, What happened? What she said settled over me slowly, like slime. Maggie's neighborhood was underwater, and she, my brother, and her kids went to a friend's house on high ground. There were a dozen of others there in the same situation. One of them was Tom's older sister. Maggie introduced herself and asked after Tom. His sister was worried, and she'd not heard from him since the storm. Maggie said, "Well, I wouldn't worry. I bet the government has a list of VIPs to check on, and Mr. Tom is surely on it." Tom's sister said, "Maggie, I don't know what Tom has told you, but not a general, not a ranger. There is no air marshal program. No Condoleezza Rice, no Colin Powell, no nothing. Tom was a penny ante lawyer." What was true was that Tom's sister's deceased husband was a Korean vet, a ranger, a high ranker, and a spy. Tom grew up admiring everything about his brother-in-law. At some point, Tom's dreary real-life lawyer job faded from his reality and his fantasies replaced them. The truly sick and disturbing thing was that his daughter and ex-wife were very much alive. They just written him off when his detachment became too much. So he took them off in his narrative. Still, his daughter had the heart to take him in after Katrina destroyed the apartment building, as we found out later. My girlfriend watched my face collapse as I talked to Maggie, and she was equally devastated when I told her after I got off the phone. I had so many questions. What if I had followed up on the air marshal thing? Then some of the particulars hit me. He said he was only promoted to the general ranks after retirement, so he would have had an answer as to why he wasn't listed in the Army's website general officer biographies. It's like writing a screenplay, coming up with plausible explanations for in the story or character development. Maggie ran into him a couple of months after Katrina. He was all smiles, and Maggie said, "Stop. Your sister told me everything." He just laughed and said, "Oh, that old bat's crazy." That was the last any of us ever heard of him. I've Googled him but have not found anything. I'm just glad my father passed away without knowing the truth. He would have been bereft. I'm saddened by my father having been played like a fool in his last years, but I'm also sad for Tom. The gloves in the water and all that was BS, but his tears weren't. Nor was his graciousness at dinner with my sister and me. With life in Washington, D.C., being phony and his relatives having written him off, my dad and our family were really the closest people he had in his life. Wow. I can't imagine living my whole life with that kind of lie. I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you made it this far, I'm sure you'll also enjoy. Waiters, what seriously f***ed up things have you overheard? Story 4 is so wild. See you on that video.